In 1929, organized crime attempted to bomb a man whose only crime was building taxicabs. His name was Morris Markin. The mob controlled Chicago's taxi industry, the routes, the licenses, the money. Markin was cutting them out. So they sent a message through his window. He survived. Then he fought back, and what he built next became the most recognizable vehicle in American film history. The yellow cab you've seen in every 1970s New York movie is his. In the next minutes, you'll get the full story they buried. To understand what happened, you have to understand what America looked like in the 1920s. Prohibition had begun in 1920. The sale of alcohol was illegal across the entire country, and the immediate result was not sobriety. The immediate result was the birth of organized crime at industrial scale. Gangs that had operated in small neighborhoods suddenly had something to sell that every American wanted. They built networks, they built supply chains, they built relationships with politicians, with judges, with police departments, and most importantly, they built cash, and cash needed somewhere to go. Legitimate businesses were the answer. A laundry, a restaurant, a hotel. These were the structures organized crime used to move money, to establish presence, to make themselves untouchable. And taxis were perfect. Think about it. A taxi fleet is a cash business. Thousands of small transactions every day, all in coins and paper bills, none of it easy to trace. A fleet of 50 cabs generates enough daily cash to hide almost anything inside the accounting. So by the mid-1920s, the major taxi fleets in Chicago and New York were not just businesses. They were infrastructure. They were territory. Controlling a taxi company in 1920 Chicago meant controlling a piece of the city itself. And that is the world Morris Markin had decided to compete in. Morris Markin had arrived at Ellis Island in 1913 with no English, no contacts, and not enough money to be legally admitted into the United States. He borrowed $25 from a janitor he had just met, a stranger, someone whose name history never recorded. With those $25, he walked into America. He found work in Chicago as a tailor. He was precise, he was disciplined, he saved everything he earned. Within a few years, he had bought the shop where he started as an employee. When that business grew profitable, he used the money to bring his brothers and sisters to America one by one. When World War I began, the U.S. Army needed uniforms. Markin had a tailoring operation and the capacity to fill large orders. He took the contract. The money came in fast and in volume. For the first time in his life, Morris Markin had real capital. Not just enough to survive, enough to think bigger. What he thought about was the taxi industry. In 1919, an auto body company called Lombard Auto Body ran into financial trouble. Markin lent them $15,000, a significant sum for a man who had entered the country 6 years earlier in debt to a janitor. When Lombard went bankrupt in 1921, Markin didn't demand repayment. He took the company. Then came Commonwealth Motors, a small taxi assembler drowning in post-war debt. Markin saw what others saw as wreckage. He saw foundation. He merged the two struggling companies into one. And in 1922, quietly, without announcement, Checker Cab Manufacturing was born. From the very beginning, Checker operated differently. It was the first taxi company in America to hire black drivers. At a time when segregation was law in many states, Checker required every one of its drivers to pick up every passenger, regardless of race, regardless of neighborhood, regardless of anything. That was not a marketing strategy. That was a statement of principle, and it put the company in direct conflict with some very powerful people from the very first day. By the late 1920s, Checker had grown. The Model K, introduced in 1928, had given the company a product that taxi fleet operators genuinely trusted, not fast, not glamorous, but built around one principle: durability over everything. Drivers knew that when they showed up at 4 in the morning, the Checker would start. It would run. It would be there. That reputation had spread. Chicago fleets were buying Checkers. New York was buying Checkers. Smaller cities across the Midwest were buying Checkers. Checker had become a serious player. And serious players attract serious enemies. In 1929, Morris Markin made the move that lit the fuse. He purchased Yellow Cab, one of the most established taxi companies in the country, from a businessman named John Hertz. The same John Hertz who would later found the Hertz rental car company. On paper, this was a straightforward acquisition. One company buying another. Business as usual. But in the world of the American taxi industry in 1929, a world where fleet ownership was tied to organized crime, where territory was defended with violence, where men who controlled cab companies controlled pieces of cities, this acquisition was not business as usual. This was a declaration of war. Markin now controlled Yellow Cab and Checker Cab. He had effectively made himself the dominant taxi manufacturer and operator in two of the most important cities in America. The established players, men who had built their positions over years, men who had invested in relationships and arrangements that now felt threatened, did not respond with lawsuits or press releases. They responded the way the 1920s responded to threats. What followed became known as the Taxi Wars. It began with property. Checker vehicles were found burned in the streets, not vandalized, not damaged, burned completely. A fleet operator would arrive at his garage in the morning and find 3 cabs destroyed overnight, frames twisted, rubber melted, everything gone. Then it moved to people. Drivers were beaten on their routes, not robbed, not confronted in arguments. Beaten specifically, deliberately, to send a message. Men who drove checker cabs found themselves targeted on specific streets at specific hours. This was not random violence, this was coordinated. Gangs were hired, their job was simple: destroy checkers' operations street by street, shift by shift. Intimidate the drivers, intimidate the customers, make the checker cab feel dangerous to be near. The battle played out in Chicago primarily, but it extended to New York and other cities where the major fleets competed for territory. Cars were sabotaged, garages were vandalized. The men behind it had money, connections, and no concern for the legal consequences. The violence reached its peak on a night that Morris Markin would never forget. Someone threw a bomb through the window of his home, not his office, his home. No one was killed. But no message could have been clearer. This was not a business dispute being escalated. This was a notification. Either Markin surrendered, or the next explosion would be aimed more carefully. Markin understood exactly what the message meant. He had not survived childhood poverty in Smolensk, an immigration process that nearly turned him away at the door, and a decade of building a company from nothing to surrender to men with bombs. But he was also not foolish. He looked at Chicago and understood that remaining there meant remaining in the center of a war that had no rules and no end. The gangs that were targeting him were not going to run out of money. They were not going to be arrested. They had too many relationships with the people who were supposed to arrest them. Fighting them on their turf was a losing strategy. So he chose a different strategy. He left. In 1929, Morris Markin relocated the entire checker manufacturing operation to Kalamazoo, Michigan. Not a satellite office, not a second facility. Everything. The factory, the equipment, the workforce, the entire production infrastructure of checker cab manufacturing moved from Chicago to a mid-sized city in western Michigan that no one in organized crime cared about. It was one of the smartest decisions he ever made. Kalamazoo had no gang networks, no territorial disputes, no men who considered taxi fleets part of their inheritance. It had workers. It had a factory floor. It had exactly what Checker needed: distance from the war and space to build. And from Kalamazoo, over the next 3 decades, Checker would build the cars that defined American urban life. But the move to Kalamazoo did not end the threats against Morris Markin. The second predator was more dangerous than the first. Because this one wore a suit, carried a briefcase, and operated inside the law, or at least close enough to it that the law took years to catch up. His name was Errett Laban Cord. In 1929, the same year as the Taxi Wars, the American stock market collapsed. October 29th, Black Tuesday. The Great Depression swept across the country with a speed and force that dismantled everything the previous decade had built. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment climbed to levels that seemed impossible. Streets that had been full of spending and optimism became streets full of breadlines and men who had lost everything. The taxi industry, entirely dependent on people having enough spare money to hail a cab, nearly disappeared. Checker, already stretched by the violence of the Taxi Wars and now hemorrhaging revenue in the Depression, became vulnerable. And Errett Cord could see it. Cord was one of the most powerful figures in American industry at the time, the man behind Auburn Automobile. The man behind Cord Motor Car, a brand so advanced that it was producing front-wheel drive vehicles years before they became standard. The man behind Duesenberg, the most prestigious car in America, the car that gave rise to the phrase, "It's a doozy." He was brilliant, he was ruthless, and he was completely comfortable operating in the space between legal and illegal. When he saw Checker weakened, he moved in. By 1932, the losses had forced Markin to step back from the chairman's seat. Cord took control of the company. And then something extraordinary happened. Checker stock, which had been trading at around $7 a share, forgotten, barely noticed, just another beaten-down Depression-era equity, began to rise, slowly at first. Then, faster. Buy orders started coming in from accounts connected to shell companies. Companies with names that meant nothing, registered to addresses that led nowhere, owned by entities that dissolved before anyone could trace them. The price climbed to $15, then $20, then $40. And then, on a single morning, in the darkest economic period America had ever experienced, while the rest of the country was standing in breadlines, while banks were closing their doors, while 1 in 4 American workers had no job, Checker stock hit $69 a share. A nearly tenfold increase. In the middle of the Great Depression, the SEC saw the irregularity immediately. Investigators began tracing every transaction, peeling back every layer of the shell companies, following every account that had placed buy orders, and every path, no matter how many turns it took, led to the same center. Cord. He had manufactured the appearance of a surging company to drive the stock price up, then positioned himself to profit from the collapse. It was fraud, methodical, sophisticated, and on a scale that shocked even the investigators who uncovered it. When the investigation became public, the Cord empire began to fracture. Stock values fell, banks withdrew. The financial markets, which had tolerated Cord's methods for years, turned against him completely, and Markin, with the stubbornness of a man who had once survived on a borrowed $25 at an immigration desk, gathered what remained of his resources and bought Checker back before the Cord empire finished collapsing. He didn't just save the company, he reclaimed everything it had been built to represent. Think about what had just happened. In the space of roughly 3 years, Markin had survived the gang bombing of his home, relocated an entire manufacturing operation to a different state, navigated the worst economic collapse in American history, and defeated a sophisticated Wall Street predator who had temporarily stolen his company. He had done all of it without connections, without political protection, without the advantages that most men in his position would have considered essential. He had done it with the same combination of stubbornness, intelligence, and refusal to accept defeat that had carried him through an immigration checkpoint with borrowed money 19 years earlier. What came after was, by any standard, remarkable. World War II interrupted civilian production. Checker's assembly lines shifted to military trailers, rescue vehicles, and an extraordinary four-wheel drive Jeep prototype that the Army tested across mud, sand, and extreme terrain. It didn't win a mass production contract. But it proved something important, that a small company in Kalamazoo with limited resources and no government backing had developed military-grade engineering that the major manufacturers hadn't managed. When the war ended, the stamping dies that gave Checker cars their shape had been destroyed. Everything had to be rebuilt from nothing. Markin brought in 2 of the most respected design minds in the American industry, Herbert Snow, who had shaped the bold lines of Studebaker, and Ray Dietrich, whose work on luxury vehicles in the 1930s had set the standard for automotive elegance. They pushed Checker into territory it had never explored. Rear engine layouts. Face-to-face passenger seating like a train compartment, a front-wheel drive configuration with a transverse engine, the same layout that would become standard across the global auto industry decades later. All of it was eventually shelved. Too expensive. Too complicated for a small factory with limited capital. But in 1956, Checker arrived at the design that would define its legacy, the Model A8. And then, in 1961, the Model 11. The car that ran for 20 consecutive years without a single model change. The car that no manufacturer in modern automotive history, not Ford, not General Motors, not Chrysler, has ever matched in uninterrupted production. The car that drivers called a truck disguised as a taxi, and meant it as the highest possible compliment. New York adopted it. Chicago adopted it. Cities across the country adopted it. By the early 1960s, Checker Motors was not one of several taxi manufacturers. It was the taxi manufacturer. The industry had consolidated around its product. The silhouette of the Checker cab had become as recognizable as any symbol in American visual culture. Now let's stop here for a moment. Because to truly understand what Checker Motors built, not just as a company, but as a cultural force, You have to understand what New York City was in the 1960s and 1970s. This was not the cleaned-up, tourist-friendly New York of today. This was a city on the edge. Crime was rising every year. The subway was covered in graffiti from top to bottom. Not street art, not curated expression, just the visual record of a city that had stopped trying to maintain itself. Whole neighborhoods in the Bronx were being abandoned. Landlords were burning their own buildings for insurance money. The city nearly went bankrupt in 1975. So close that the Daily News ran one of the most famous headlines in newspaper history: Ford to City, drop dead. This was the New York of Travis Bickle, of the French Connection, of Shaft walking through Harlem, of a city that felt like it was permanently one bad night away from something irreversible. And through all of it, through the crime and the bankruptcy and the graffiti and the fires, the checker cab moved. Every morning, before the city had fully woken up, the checkers were already running. Drivers who had learned the streets the way musicians learn scales, by feel, by repetition, by years of making the same turns in the dark. They knew which blocks flooded when it rained. They knew which lights ran long. They knew where to wait and when to move. The checker was not just transportation. It was a mobile room inside a city that could feel hostile and overwhelming. You stepped off a sidewalk full of noise and pressure and unpredictability. You opened that wide door, you sat down in the back of a checker, and for a few minutes, you were enclosed. You were moving. You were somewhere between where you had been and where you were going. Writers used that space. Directors used it. Actors used it. Martin Scorsese didn't choose the checker cab for Taxi Driver because it looked good on screen. He chose it because it was there. Because in 1976, when Robert De Niro played Travis Bickle crawling through the rain-slick streets of Manhattan, the checker was what a New York cab looked like. There was nothing to choose. It was simply the truth of that city at that moment. William Friedkin filmed the chase scene in The French Connection through the streets of Brooklyn in 1971. The cabs in the background. Checkers. Every one of them. Midnight Cowboy, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Kramer vs. Kramer, Annie Hall. These films were not set in a studio recreation of New York. They were filmed in New York, on real streets with real traffic, with real cabs rolling past in the background. And those cabs, every single one, was a checker. Think about what that means. The visual record of the most filmed city in the world, across the most cinematically documented decade in American history, is saturated with a single vehicle. A vehicle built by one company. A company started by an immigrant from Smolensk who borrowed $25 at an immigration desk and refused, for the rest of his life, to accept the limits that the world kept trying to place on him. Every frame of film that captured the mood of that era, the danger and the energy and the grime and the strange beauty of a city that was half falling apart. Every one of those frames has a checker in it somewhere, not as a prop, not as a set piece, as the background of America itself. There is a particular shot. You've seen it 1,000 times without registering it, where a camera is positioned at street level on a Manhattan block at night. Rain on the pavement, steam rising from a grate. The street lights catching the wet surface and throwing it back as orange and white light. And in the middle of that shot, moving through the frame, unhurried, inevitable, a yellow checker cab. That image has appeared in so many films, so many television shows, so many photographs, that it has become shorthand for an entire era. When a director wants to say New York 1970s, they don't need title cards, they don't need dialogue. They put a checker cab in the shot, and every viewer in the world understands immediately where and when they are. That is not advertising. That is not brand strategy. That is something rarer and more durable. That is what it looks like when a product becomes part of the way a culture sees itself. Markin never sought that. He wasn't trying to build an icon. He was trying to build a cab that would start every morning and run every shift and not break down in the middle of a fare. The icon was a side effect of doing that well enough, for long enough, in the right city at the right moment in history. And yet, ask 100 people on the street who built the yellow cabs in Taxi Driver or The French Connection or Midnight Cowboy. Almost none of them will say Checker Motors. Almost none of them will say Markin. The car is iconic. The man who built it is invisible. Why? Part of the answer is simple geography. Markin built his empire in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Not Detroit, not New York, not a city that had a mythology attached to it. A mid-sized Midwestern city that the people who write cultural history rarely visit. Part of the answer is the nature of the company. Checker was a specialist. It made one thing, commercial vehicles for urban taxi service. It had no luxury division to attract wealthy collectors, no racing pedigree to generate magazine covers, no celebrity endorsements because celebrity culture in the 1950s and 60s was not interested in what your taxi driver drove. Part of the answer is Morris Markin himself. He did not court attention. He did not give interviews. He did not build a personal mythology. He built cars. He managed his company. He survived. And that was already more than most people would have managed. But there is something larger at work here. The men America remembers. Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt are remembered partly because they built something large enough and famous enough that the cultural machinery of celebration had no choice but to engage with them. Markin built something that was genuinely extraordinary, a company that survived mob violence and a depression and a hostile takeover and produced the most durable commercial vehicle in American history. A company that stood for fairness in an era of segregation. A company whose product became the visual language of urban America for 30 years. And then the company closed, and the cultural machinery moved on. Nobody held a ceremony. Nobody put up a statue. The last car came off the line in July 1982, and the factory went quiet, and that was that. The man who had arrived at Ellis Island with 25 borrowed dollars and built all of it was not there to see the end. Morris Markin died in 1970, 12 years before the company closed. He had watched it reach the peak of its power. He had not lived to watch it fail. Perhaps that is the kindest thing history ever did for him. After 1982, Checker attempted to survive as a parts manufacturer, stamping body components for General Motors and Cadillac. It was work. It kept people employed. But it was a fundamental transformation from a company that had shaped American culture into a supplier producing parts inside someone else's supply chain. The 2008 financial crisis eliminated what remained. Demand collapsed. General Motors required a federal bailout. Checker, with no bailout forthcoming and no product left to sell, declared complete bankruptcy in 2009. The assets were auctioned. The equipment went to recyclers. The headquarters, the building from which Morris Markin had overseen the construction of hundreds of thousands of cars across decades, sold for under $3 million in 2010. And then the final footnote. David Markin, Morris's son, the last CEO of Checker Motors, watched the family's remaining fortune disappear, not in a boardroom, not in a factory, but in a federal courtroom. Bernie Madoff's fraud had claimed thousands of victims across America. David Markin was among them. The family that had built an empire starting from 25 borrowed dollars at an immigration checkpoint ended with nothing left. The next time you watch a film set in 1970s New York, and you see that yellow box moving through the rain, through the steam rising from a grate, through the noise and the light of a city that no longer quite exists, I want you to remember something. That car wasn't a prop. It wasn't chosen by a set designer for its visual appeal. It was simply there because it was always there. Because Morris Markin had embedded Checker Motors so completely into the fabric of American urban life that filming a street scene without one would have felt like a lie. The mob tried to stop him with a bomb. Cord tried to stop him with fraud. The Depression tried to stop him with bankruptcy. He survived all of it. The only thing that eventually stopped him was time. And an industry that changed faster than a small factory in Kalamazoo could change with it. But here is the thing about Morris Markin that matters most. He was not supposed to succeed. He arrived in this country with nothing, in debt to a stranger, speaking no English, with no plan. Every structure that was supposed to keep men like him out, the immigration desk, the established players, the organized crime networks, the Depression, the Wall Street predators, he went through all of it. And on the other side, he built something that lasted 60 years. Something that became the visual language of the most filmed city in the world. Something that, even now, you can still see in every black and white photograph of the streets he helped define. That is the story of the man nobody talks about. If you think he deserves to be remembered, like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still wonders where all the yellow cabs went. More stories like this one are coming. Companies that shaped the world and then quietly disappeared from it. See you on the next ride.